Welcome to another episode of the Krytan, wait for it, Chronicler. I'm your host, Anchor, and today we'll be following Eckhart on his continuing adventures across Tyria. Last time we left him in the city of Ebonhawk, and now he's making his way back to the Citadel. As he was traveling the roads, he encountered this familiar face. You may recognize Nihilus, because he's been in like 50% of the...
Hand over those supplies, and
what's
we may
going on here?
spare you.
This doesn't sound good.
These supplies are for Nogling and nobody else.
Fine. Have it your way. Kill them all!
Uh-oh. Well, as you can see, it's never a dull day in Tyria. But that's the thing I love about role-playing abroad, is you get all these dynamic events and random encounters that spicing things up a little bit. There's, as Nihilus says, never a dull moment. Now, some role players prefer not to roleplay in these environments for that specific reason.
Double time it to Nogling.
Because it can be a little stressful if you're trying to type out a long paragraph and all of a sudden you get into a battle which just screws everything up that you were trying to do. But to me, I feel like that's a symptom of trying to plan things too much. You know, it's the same problem with all role-playing. When you try to take too much control over the story, it just... all these really awkward mistakes and interruptions can come in, which just takes you completely out of the story. It breaks your immersion. You'll be far more rewarded if you just go with the flow. It's okay to have like an idea of what you want your character to do, but also be open to go in completely new directions. For example, I was not planning to run into a Norn out in the fields here, but luckily because of that dynamic event, we happen to be in the same area, and I didn't even know if this person is a role player. I just started role playing at them. I still don't know if they're a role player, but they were courteous enough to role play a little bit back and say a few words and acknowledge us, which was nice. But if I had been super focused on just keeping a private meeting between me and Nihilus, between Eckhart and Nihilus, and I had this plan that it was just supposed to be the two of us, then I would have completely ignored this other character, which could have possibly prevented me from interacting with a new person and involving a new character and making things more interesting. And the other problem is, if a dynamic event like that does jump in on you, then it's going to throw off your story a little bit. So try to stay flexible and stay open to the different things that are happening around you, and just try to react as honestly as you think your character would, and then you're gonna have fun. That's the thing about role-playing. It's not a play. You're not trying to like memorize lines and then repeat them in the perfect order. It's improvisation. You're just sort of playing with it. It's try and think back to when you were a kid and used to play with dolls or play with action figures. You know, just sort of make it up as you go. I do have a bit of a cold, so I apologize if I'm a little hard to understand, but I'm fingers crossed I survived this hour-long episode, and it is a bit of a long episode. As I was saying before, I ran into Nihilus here as Eckhart was on his way back to the Citadel. And now, from Nihilus's perspective, he hasn't seen Eckhart in a while, since he's been out exploring Ascalon, which is the Char homeland.
Is that trouble punk back again?
But even though we sort of ran into each other spontaneously, it wasn't completely spontaneous. I did see that Nihilus was in the area. I could see him on my friends list, so I knew he was there. So I figured might as well try and catch up with him, see what he was up to. But of course, from our character's perspective, they wouldn't know this. They wouldn't know that, you know, they happen to be nearby. They don't have a radar that goes off whenever one of them is near. So we kind of role-played that it was a spontaneous bumping into each other. And Nihilus explained that he was on the way back to Lion's Arch, and they're sort of getting together for a bit of a guild meeting. Not really a meeting, it's more of a just a get together just for some drinks and to share stories. So I thought it would be a good chance to show some more guild focused role playing and also some tavern focused role playing, because that's what a lot of role playing consists of. It's really just hanging out in taverns, focusing mostly on dialogue and getting to know other characters. I tend to shy away from taverns for the most part because I just prefer adventure and spontaneity, but it can be fun to just relax and just focus on the dialogue where you're not worried about getting attacked every 5 seconds. And this character here, Crit Mistwalker, is another member of the Tyrian Adventure League, Eckhart's guild. And this is also another sort of a spontaneous encounter. Of course, our characters didn't know we were going to run into him, but we just happened to see him in the Citadel. And he's just explaining that he's doing some recruiting for his warband. And so if you know anything about Char lore, that you'll know that their warband is basically their family. It's also their co-workers. Everything they do is with their warband. So it's very important, the recruiting process, which is why Crit has been interviewing someone, as he explained there. And now we did take the Asura Gate back to Lion's Arch, so we got there a bit faster than usual. And keep in mind, this is the first time Eckhart has been back to Lion's Arch since it was destroyed. I mean, you saw in the previous episodes, he was there during the fighting, but this is sort of the aftermath of all that fighting, after Scarlet's been defeated, and you can see that the city is a very different place than what it used to be. Even in, I think it was episode 3, that was the first time he went to Lion's Arch. You can see huge differences. There's so much destruction and chaos everywhere. And even Nyla says the island where the Asura Gates used to be, now it's just a memorial for all the heroes who fought during the battle. So this wasn't very difficult for me to roleplay, because not only was it Eckhart's first time being back, but it was also my first time as a player visiting this area of the game, so the reaction was very genuine from my perspective. Now, of course, Nihilus, you may remember, was once a resident of Lion's Arch. Currently, he's staying somewhere else, but it adds so much to his character that he has this connection with the city. Because even, as you said there, you know, a lot of the people that died during the battle, to him, were neighbors and friends that he had lived with and explored the city with. So picking a place for your character to live, it's good to work these things out when you're creating your character, because it really creates your character's bond and connection to the world. If they have a home to go to or a place that they're fighting for. But up here we did eventually reconnect with a few of our guild mates here. And I do apologize for the NPCs in the background. They're gonna repeat that little conversation probably 100 times before the end of this episode. But I do eventually figure out that you can mute them, so hopefully it won't get too annoying by then. Now, you can see Keela here is, if you were paying close attention before, she's actually a different class than what she used to be. She's now a ranger, whereas before we've seen her in the past, she's always been a guardian. And that's a pretty simple thing to do if you have the time to actually level up multiple characters, is you can actually create the same character several times with different professions. And it doesn't mean that this is like another Keela, like some sort of clone. It's the same character. It's just that the player has expanded that character so that they have multiple skills. They can switch between being a guardian or a ranger or what else. And it's something I've wondered about doing. I don't think I'd ever create another Eckhart just to like make him into, I don't know, a thief or something. Unless it became pertinent to his, you know, character story. Like if I had to join some sort of thieves guild, then maybe I would put that work into it. But it can be a lot of work, you know, leveling up multiple characters to level 80, and then you have to go back and figure out the specific sliders for your character to make them look exactly the same. So it can be a bit of work, but also fun at the same time and keeps things interesting. Oh, and here Eckhart's just sort of taking advantage. Oh, those NPCs. Those NPCs.
I used to be a fisherman. Now I scoop bodies out of the bay.
You win.
Okay, now that they're finished, as I was saying, Eckhart is just taking advantage of a piece of lore that I found out not long before I filmed this episode. And that's that the Char have two sets of ears, one for low frequencies and one for high frequencies, which is why they find humans so annoying, is because humans speak in like a mid-range frequency, which is hard for the Char to pick up with their ears. So I kind of just played that into Eckhart's sort of role-playing here. And it made sense since he's been spending time in Ascalon that he would have learned a thing or two about Char biology.
I used to be Theo Ashford's private chef. Now the council's forcing me to cook for the refugees.
I used to be a fisherman. Now I scoop bodies out of the bay.
You win.
It can be a good idea if you're looking for new ideas for role-playing to just brush up on the lore, not even just like the big historical lore, but like the little things, you know, like that example about the Char and their hearing, or the things about, you know, the Asura, how they used to be cave dwellers, or they're still primarily cave dwellers. You know, little things like that can make for interesting conversations, and conversations are really what make up the majority of your role-playing. And here, so Keela's explaining the reason for her change in profession is that, you know, she hasn't completely left being a guardian, but as Athakis is sort of explaining here, they're kind of collecting animals. It's like a new hobby of theirs. They have a bit of a zoo that's growing, starting with this drake and now this little hippo thing, I think it is. I'm not sure what that is.
I used to be Theo Ashford's private chef. Now the council's forcing me to cook for the refugees.
I used to be a fisherman. Now I scoop bodies out of the bay.
You win.
But it actually makes sense for their characters, just because they are Char. That Char are kind of known for being beast masters, even probably not more so than the Norn, but pretty close with the Norn. You know, they are very good at taming different races of animals and using them as their war beasts. Oh, and a good example of that would be the Lashtail Hatchery, which Eckhart just mentioned, which is where the Char basically breed the scorpion things. I can't remember what they're called. Devourers, that's what they are. They breed Devourers since, you know, they're good as fighters, but also for scavenging for things. You know, the Char are notorious for scrapping and scavenging, so Devourers come in handy. And that's actually what that little, tiny little Devourer there is. It's the pet that belongs to Alessa. And you can see here, even though she doesn't directly have control over the pet, the Devourer there, not in the same way she can control her character,
Now the council's
but
forcing me to
you can
cope with the
still
refugees.
roleplay
I
and
used to be a
emote
fisherman.
on behalf
Now
of
I
that
scoop bodies out of the
NPC,
bay.
or in this case,
You
on
win.
behalf of that pet. And so whenever Biscuit, the Devourer there, does something in the chat, like it does an action, Alessa will just use like the space, the divider, and then she'll emote on behalf of the Devourer and say like, oh, the Devourer crawls up to Eckhart's leg and nibbles on it, or something like that. And for some reason, I was just off my game making typos today. Now, having these sort of
I
meetings
used to be Theo Ashford's private chef.
can be a good way to
Now the
keep
council's
track of what's
forcing me
going
to
on with
cope
different
with the
characters.
refugees.
Especially if you're in a big guild,
Now
there can
I
be a
scoop
lot of
bodies
different
out of the
members of
bay.
the guild, and
You
it
win.
can be hard to keep track of like who you've met and how you know each individual member. So having these sort of get-togethers is a good way to just establish that everyone's sort of familiar with each other, they know what's going on in each other's lives, so that the next time when I'm looking for party members, I have all these other characters that I can call upon. So it's not just like some random stranger that's coming to help me explore these dwarven ruins. You know, it's a friend who I've met before at parties like this. And of course, the Tyrian Adventure League is always recruiting. If you are looking for a role-playing guild that's, you know, it's not super heavy, but they do, you know, role-play hardcore when they are role-playing. It's a good guild to get into. They're very welcoming and friendly, so long as you are friendly as well. So you can always check them out online. I've linked to them in the past, but it's they do have an engine website for the Tyrian Adventure League. And you can see here, Nihilus was just explaining they're still recruiting. They recruited a new Asura named Big Boko, who's a bit of a merchant, and you might get to see a bit more of him in future episodes. And this is something I've talked about many times in the past. What Eckhart's talking about here is his goal of seeing all the major cities of Tyria in order to complete his apprenticeship. And this kind of goes back to what I was saying about planning. You know, it's a good idea to have a bit of an outline of what direction you want your character to take. But if you're planning every single detail of your character's story, then you can get into really awkward,
I used to be Theo Ashford's
immersion-breaking
private chef.
situations, you know?
Now
If
the
you
council's
want to
forcing me to cope with
have
the
a storyline with
refugees.
this other
I used to be a
character,
fisherman.
but then that
Now
player
I
happens to
scoop
be
bodies
sick
out of the
that
bay.
day and they
You
can't
win.
play, it's going to mess up your whole plan. It's going to mess up your whole story. You're going to have to like retcon some things and do some really awkward rewrites of things, and I try to avoid that as much as possible. It's much better to go with the flow and make things up as you go, so that way if you do have a plan to meet someone but the player just for whatever reason can't log in, then you can just easily come up with an excuse and come up with an alternative to do that day. And so even though Eckhart's goal is to go to all the cities, I'm not completely dead set on that, you know? It wasn't my plan to go to Ebonhawk, but in the last episode I happened to meet some characters who were on their way there, and I thought, oh, why not check it out, see what happens. So that's kind of my philosophy with role-playing, is just sort of see what happens. Just play your character as accurately as you can and find out what happens next. I like if you caught that emote there, Nihilus, he's, instead of just waving at the Norns, he's he had the Devourer in his hands, so he's just sort of waving the Devourer in his hands. I gotta tell you, like, the most entertaining things that happen in role-playing is the stuff that happens in your
I used to
imagination.
be Theo Ashford's private chef.
Although
Now
it
the
would be
council's
great if there was an
forcing me to
animation
cook the
for just
refugees.
waving a
I used to be a
little
fisherman.
animal at your friends.
Now I scoop bodies out of the bay.
You win.
So if you ever find yourself in situations like this where there are a lot of players and you're not exactly sure how to roleplay, I find there can be a lot of pressure to like do something and just to be interesting all the time, but you really don't have to worry about that. I find if you do come to that point where you're just not really sure what to do, it's best to take a back seat and just listen to the things that are going on around you. You know, hear the conversations and watch all the emotes that are happening. And then 9 times out of 10, something will come to you. You know, if you just wait long enough for the right opportunity, then you'll find a good chance to jump in where it makes sense, where it applies to your character. And it also lends itself to just getting into character, because if you
I used to be
find
Theo
yourself
Ashford's
really
private
getting
chef.
into the head of your character,
Now the
then
council's forcing me to cook
at
for
a
the
certain point you'll
refugees.
just sort of
I
know
used to be
what
a
to do.
fisherman. Now I scoop bodies out of the bay.
You win.
But if you're just starting out and you're still not really comfortable getting into character and role-playing in big groups like this, then my best advice would be to just sort of observe at first. You know, it's okay to be a little quiet as long as you're paying attention and staying focused and staying present with what's going on. And sooner or later, you just figure it out. Now, Alessa and Keela just returned here. What happened was they sort of stepped outside to have a bit of a private, you know, girl talk conversation. Even though we could see the conversation in the chat because they were still close enough for us to pick up on it, our characters have no knowledge of that conversation.
I used to
And that could be
Theo Ashford's private
one of the
chef.
things, one of the
Now
choices that you can make. It's just like a
cook for the refugees.
personal choice. If you're having a
Now I
private
scoop
conversation,
bodies out of the bay.
You win.
you could just assume that no one else is hearing, and you know, if they're good enough role players, they'll respect that. But another thing to do is just to use the whispering. There's the whisper function in the game, which is a good way to just make sure that nothing that you're saying gets picked up on by other players. So if you want to throw some surprises into the mix, it's a good thing to do. The only problem with the whispering is, unfortunately, there's no group whisper, I guess. You can only whisper one-on-one. So if you have a few people that are sort of huddling together and having a private conversation, then you're going to have to either form a party together and use party chat, or just use regular chat and hope that no one is a jerk and tries to interrupt you. And Call there, the Norn fellow, he was explaining his story of how he joined the Adventure League. And that's one of the things I always ask different members of my guild, is how they joined. Because even though the players might have joined for a number of different reasons, maybe they just had a friend who was in the league and they sent them an invite, or they just looked him up online, or maybe they were watching the show and was like, hey, I should check out this guild. But if you do that, you're going to have to come up with a reason or a story that your character joined, you know, the reason that they joined, and that's what Call is explaining. So even though the player has been with the guild for a long time, this is a new character, so he's going to need some sort of backstory of how he found out about the guild. And in some cases, like with Eckhart, it might actually be something that happened while role-playing. You know, I happened to meet Nihilus and Skull, if you'll recall in the previous episode. Skull, if you'll recall. I'm sure there's a tongue twister in there somewhere. But that's how we met. You know, we were just role-playing together, and it just happened naturally. But you don't have to join a guild while you're playing. You can always go look for them out of character and then just come up with a reason you joined later. So I'm not even sure if what Call is explaining is something that actually happened while they were playing together, or if he just sort of made up this little story on his own. In fact, I think it must be made up, because the character he was talking about, who was it? The Asura that he was talking about, I think, is also another one of his characters, so they couldn't physically be in the same place at the same time. Now, this is something I've sort of mentioned in the past, which is when you're creating characters and you happen to have a friend who's also a role player, it can be really fun to create characters together that have a connection. And the example I gave before was creating family members. You could have like a brother and a sister, and that could just be it, you know, like totally independent characters. It's your character, but you have this one connection that's already established the moment you start role-playing. Another good idea is, if you're a Char, even more significant than blood relatives would be your warband, you know? So if you're playing with other role players who want to role play as Char, then it might be a good and fun idea to create a warband first, and then you can create like a bunch of different characters in that warband, which is sort of what these players did. I mean, I think they were originally in different warbands, but eventually sort of formed a warband together, which is of course the Mist warband. So you can see their surnames are a reflection of the warband that they serve in. And Eckhart's sort of getting a bit of a crash course in Char nomenclature. He's just asking about how they got their names and the story behind their warband.
I used to be Theo Ashford's private chef. Now the council's forcing me to cook for the refugees.
I used to be a fisherman. Now I...
I used to be Theo Ashford's private chef. Now the council's forcing me to cook for the refugees.
I used to be a fisherman. Now I scoop bodies out of the bay.
You win.
And if you have a chance, you should definitely keep an eye on the chat, because there are other conversations happening in the background that are also very interesting.
Now I scoop bodies
But of
out
course,
the
I
bay.
tend to focus just specifically on what Eckhart is doing and saying and who he's talking to, because it can be a bit overwhelming if you try and pay attention to everything that's going on around you. Unless you have a really good attention span, in which case, well, you're perfect for these sorts of role-playing situations. But if you're like me, then this is kind of how I keep track of things. Now, Eckhart is sort of lamenting on how boring his last name is. You know, you just heard the story of how Athakis and Keela got their names. And to him, it seems super fascinating because it's like this exotic and completely different culture where they sort of choose their own names. Like half of it is based on their warband and half of it is kind of just based on the reputation or what they're sort of known for. And so Eckhart finds it very fascinating. But I really liked how Athakis sort of role-played the opposite. I mean, to him,
I used to be a fisherman.
human names are
Now
very
I scoop
interesting
bodies out
for a
of the bay.
Char because
You win.
Char really don't have families. They don't pass down their names from generation to generation. So for Eckhart to have this name that's, you know, survived for centuries, that you can go like centuries back and find other members of his family with the same name, to him that seems very fascinating. And I like that the player was familiar enough with his own character's culture to really have that perspective, because to us, like, we're all humans, so having a last name that's the same as your parents is not a weird thing. It's totally common all over the world. But, you know, when you go into a fantasy world like this, you have to put yourself in the position of this completely different race that has a completely different culture. And so to them, something like having a family name would be very strange and interesting in this case. And it can kind of make you appreciate your own heritage a bit more. Because even I didn't really think about that, you know, the fact that you can go back centuries. I mean, I know there are people who will do this, you know, professionally. They're, you know, historians, but you can look back for centuries and find members of your family that traced all the way back to, you know, in some cases, the beginning of different cultures and nations. And so that can be very interesting, whereas like a Char, they wouldn't have that opportunity. And as I mentioned, Eckhart is planning to head to the Grove next, so I thought it would be good to brush up on my Sylvari culture before going there. And since Zeranis is one of the few Sylvari that Eckhart actually knows, it seemed like a perfect person to ask a few questions about their culture. Now, Eckhart, he doesn't like to make any assumptions when it comes to other races, especially at this point that he's kind of had his beliefs turned upside down more than once. And so even when it comes to just saying hello, he's not even sure what the right way to do that is in Sylvari culture. You know, for all he knows, they might not have a word or a greeting for hello. Now, it's important to note that, as Nyla says here, their characters do have sort of off-screen responsibilities. And I say off-screen because these are things that happen that they don't actually play out. These are just things that are happening while they're not, you know, out and about, actually logged into the game. You know, I've said before that Eckhart, I like to imagine what he's doing when he's, you know, staying in the city like Lion's Arch, or when he's doing in Holbrack. Even though I might not be playing all the time, I still like to sort of have an idea what he's up to, so that, you know, when I see someone, I can, you know, have a quick answer for what I've been up to. And that's sort of the same with Nihilus here. He explains that they have cubs to look after, and so it lets you know that he does have this other life that he leads when he's not out adventuring. And it's a good idea to come up with a few responsibilities. I mean, every person is going to have some sort of responsibility or duty. They might even have like a job that they go to when they're not adventuring or just at a tavern role-playing. So it's really good to flesh out your character in those ways.
Hey!
Now, luckily at this point, I did figure out how to mute the NPC dialogue on the back, and I probably should explain that just in case some people are wondering how to do that. You can go into the audio options, I think, and I think it's just under NPC dialogue. You can set the volume just down to 0. So it can be good if you're role-playing in one spot for a long time. I mean, usually I love listening to that stuff, but if you're in one spot for a long time and you just have to listen to it over and over and over again, especially when it is repeated so often as this one is, then it could be really distracting. But luckily I did figure that out before, you know, my ears started bleeding. Now, if you were wondering why Nihilus and Alessa suddenly had to take off so quickly, I believe it's because this character anyways is the same player as Alessa, I believe. I keep forgetting which character belongs to which player, just because I keep my out of character and in character lives so separated. But yeah, that's why they took off sort of suddenly. It was in order to switch to these other characters. Now, this player, wisely paying attention to the fact that Eckhart was headed to the Grove, noticed that it would be a good opportunity for him to roleplay with other Sylvari, you know, and help him learn about Sylvari culture. So I was appreciative of the fact that they, you know, were showing me this side of the lore that I hadn't picked up on my own. And she's just explaining the Soundless, which is a culture, a subculture of the Sylvari that have kind of diverged from the main group. They kind of don't share the same connection to the Pale Tree that other Sylvari do. And that's sort of what Alex is explaining. And Alex is a very unique Sylvari in that respect, also because of her very unique vernacular, as you'll see. Okay, now take a look at Ciara's eyes and tell me they're not glowing.
Hey!
This is, I don't know if this is a glitch, but I assume that, I don't know, she just made some changes to her character, because when I saw that, I'm like, whoa. what did you do to your eyes? But apparently it must have been a glitch on my end. But if you don't remember, Ciara is the human that Eckhart encountered in the Shiver Peaks. I believe it was episode 10. It's I'm glad I've gotten high enough in episodes that I can't even remember which one is which. But yeah, she was in a previous episode, and she did end up joining the Tyrian Adventure League. Oh, and I kind of had to skip over Peligan's intro, but Peligan is another Sylvari who's a member of the League, and he also happens to be an engineer, so Eckhart and him were just sort of going over their favorite devices. I couldn't fit all of that in the episode, unfortunately, but Peligan, like Eckhart, is also a bit of a newcomer to engineering. He's still a bit of a rookie, just like Eckhart. And so it was nice to have someone else to role play with and discuss, you know, different engineering techniques with. See, her eyes are glowing. Look at her, look at the top. Look at her face icon. Her eyes are glowing red. It's really creeping me out. I don't know why no one else could see that, but I guess it's one of those weird glitches you kind of have to role play your way out of, because even though I was seeing this, no one else was seeing the glowing eyes. Just chalked it up to Eckhart, you know, being a bit too teary-eyed from seeing all the destruction in Lion's Arch. Now, as I mentioned, Alex has a very unique vocabulary, which is why this book exists, as Bowian was explaining. It's a book, basically like a dictionary of all the words that Alex uses, sort of to help translate what she's saying. And this is actually an actual document that the player wrote. It's up online. If they're okay with it, I'll share it with you, but they actually came up with a full list of all the words that Alex uses and what they mean. You know, like bruv and posh and wiv, you know, all the things she says that are, you know, you can still kind of understand it without it. I mean, I've so far been able to understand what she's saying, but it's really just neat that this player created like completely new dialect almost for this one character. And see there in the private party chat, Bowian's just explaining to me that there's a copy of the lexicon on the forums, and hopefully, if they don't mind, they'll let me post a link to it, because it is pretty impressive, to say the least. Now, there is another Sylvari that joined us. Unfortunately, just because there are so many different characters and conversations going on, it was impossible to fit all of it into one episode with it still making sense. So I had to skip over it a bit, but there's the other character, the very elderly-looking Sylvari in the back there, Ainwil, who also has a very unique way of talking, kind of like how I would imagine a tree to talk if they could. But you'll get to see a bit of dialogue with that character, but unfortunately wasn't too much time to get to know them, as I was starting to wrap things up about this time. But the theme of the episode seems to be pets, since just about everyone in this episode showed up with one, except for Eckhart. I felt a little left out. Although I guess he does have his turrets, you know, they're kind of like pets, mechanical and constantly breaking down pets. But yeah, everyone seemed to be showing them off at this little party, which was kind of neat. It's almost like having one character as your main character, but it's like a character and a half, because your pet is also kind of like a mini character. They have a bit of their own personality too, if you put the thought into it. Now this raccoon, however, isn't really Ciara's pet, not by the role-playing definition, you know, not in character anyways. She just explains it's just a little animal that's been following her around. And for some reason, Ivan was the first name that came to mind when I looked at it. I don't know, I think it looks like an Ivan, but that could just be me. But Eckhart here decided that they should come up with a name for it, since he's seems to be a new friend. I also feel like Sniffs should be my nickname now, since that's what I've been doing all day. But yeah, here I was, even though I was trying to make suggestions for a name, at the end of the day I wanted to let Ciara know that really it should be up to her. That player is the one who introduced this new element, so I kind of wanted to let them have creative control over it. And so you can see there, yeah, Ainwil, even though the player didn't explicitly explain the way that she talks, just by the way that the character, you know, the words are typed out, you know, with these really long vowels. Like, I sort of picture her saying, like, it's the easiest way, you know? She really draws her words out very long, which to me is kind of like how I picture a tree talking, you know? Someone, you'd have to have a lot of patience to have a conversation with a tree, because they're just, everything is so slow, and they have all the time in the world, and I really like that sort of personality characteristic of that character. Now that is actually a throwback to something that she did call me back in, I think episode 5, maybe 5 or 6. And yeah, I was glad that she remembered that. Now, it seemed like things were starting to die down at this point of the party. And like I've said in the past, you know, it's you don't want to get too involved with things for too long. You know, if you see things starting to wrap up, then it's a good idea to call it quits. Especially it seems like the story is dying down a little bit, rather than try and drag it on for a long time. And plus, for me, it was pretty late, so that can be a good excuse. You know, we all have real lives to attend to. But before we end off this episode, there are a few things I want to mention. One is a YouTube video that I discovered about... It's another role-playing video. I believe the channel is pronounced Wubdor. I'm not exactly sure, but basically it's role-playing, a guide to getting started. And this is another YouTuber that plays Guild Wars 2, so it's useful because it applies specifically to role-playing in Guild Wars 2, and you might find some useful information in there. So I'll leave a link below the video to that video, and I hope you check it out. Also, I do want to mention that since the last episode, we did reach 100 subscribers, and I'm very excited about that. As you can see, I have upgraded slightly my video editing software. You know, I've been experimenting with these new subtitles, and hopefully going to work on some new changes to get videos out much more frequently. But yeah, I do appreciate all the support, and I hope these videos have been somewhat useful and educational and entertaining at the very least to you. So once again, I'm Anchor. This has been an episode of the Krytan Chronicler. Thank you for watching, and keep on role-playing.